She is sitting on a low marble bench beside the Grand Canal, watching the light move across the water. She is 81 years old. Behind her stands a palace full of Picasso, Pollock, Magritte, and Ernst. In front of her, 14 small graves mark where her dogs are buried. There is no husband. There is no daughter. There is, in a sense, no family at all. And yet the woman the world will remember as the most scandalous heiress of the 20th century is not bitter. She is calm, because she knows something her cousins on Fifth Avenue never learned. The Guggenheims dug fortunes out of the earth. She dug a life out of herself. If you enjoy stories the famous names forgot to tell, subscribe so the next one finds you. This channel is for the people who want the truth under the gold leaf, not the gold leaf itself. Chapter 1. The Father Who Drowned in Evening Clothes. When the Titanic went down on a cold April night in 1912, a 13-year-old girl in New York lost a stranger she had worshipped. Her name was Marguerite Guggenheim. Everyone in the family called her Peggy. She was the middle daughter of Benjamin Guggenheim, one of 7 brothers who controlled a copper and silver empire that touched almost every metal mined in the Western Hemisphere. And on the morning the news came, she was sitting in the breakfast room of a townhouse on East 72nd Street, waiting for a father who had been 3,000 miles away for most of her life. The story she was told sounded like a romance written for a child. Her father had been a gentleman. When the ship struck the iceberg, he had returned to his cabin, dressed himself in white tie evening clothes, walked back up to the deck, and helped women and children into the lifeboats. A surviving steward repeated his words to the papers. "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down as gentlemen." He had then sat in a deck chair beside his secretary and waited. The North Atlantic was 4 degrees above freezing. He was 46 years old. The truth was uglier. Benjamin Guggenheim had been returning from Paris, not to his wife Fleurette, but from an apartment he kept with the French singer Léontine Aubar. Aubar had traveled on the Titanic with him. She had survived in lifeboat number 9. His secretary Victor Giglio had not. His valet Henry Etches had not. The family knew the affair. The press mostly did not. For Peggy this would become the structuring fact of her entire life. She had been her father's favorite, or so she said in the years afterward. He had returned from his European trips with hats and lace and small sculptures. He had been the only adult in the family who treated her like a person rather than a Guggenheim asset. And he had died, performing the role of a gentleman, on his way home from another woman. The household she came back to after the funeral was already grieving and already cold. Fleurette Seligman Guggenheim was 42 years old, a member of the New York Seligman banking family, and a woman who collected husbands' habits the way other women collected silverware. She repeated phrases 3 times. She rearranged knives at the dinner table. She corrected her daughter's posture constantly. Her response to her husband's death was to insist that the family appear, in public and in private, exactly as it had been. The townhouse ran on the same schedule. The Friday afternoon visits continued. The summer house at Allenhurst, New Jersey, reopened on the same date. But the inheritance arrived months later, and the inheritance was a public shock. The other Guggenheim brothers were each worth tens of millions of dollars by 1912. Benjamin's estate was less than $800,000. He had withdrawn from the family copper business in 1901 to pursue his own ventures. The ventures had failed quietly, while no one was looking. The legend of the gentleman drowning in evening dress was almost the only asset he had left. His 3 daughters split the estate. Peggy, Benita, and Hazel each received around $250,000 in trust, with limited income until they turned 21. By the standards of an average American household in 1912, it was unimaginable wealth. By the standards of a Guggenheim cousin, it was an embarrassment. Peggy's cousins lived in marble palaces on Fifth Avenue. Peggy lived in a brownstone now wrapped in mourning crepe. She processed all of it through a single image, her father, alone, in evening clothes, sitting on a deck chair as the water rose around his ankles. The image was beautiful. The image was a lie. The image was hers forever. In the schoolroom upstairs, she sat at a small writing desk with a German governess and a French tutor, and a Quaker teacher who was the only one who ever looked her in the eye. She read everything the household let her read, and a great deal it did not. She learned that families were performances. She learned that money was the only thing that bought the right to misbehave. she also learned very quietly that one day she would be 21, and that on that day the trust would release. And on that day, she would not be the daughter waiting for a father any longer. She would be the woman with the checkbook. She would decide where the ship was going. Chapter 2. The Ugly Duckling of a Mining Empire. Inside the most powerful Jewish family in America, the children were ranked at the dinner table like cuts of meat, and Peggy was ranked last. Her older sister Benita was considered the beauty. Her younger sister Hazel was considered the difficult one. Peggy was considered, in the precise vocabulary the women of the family used about each other, plain. Her nose had a hooked tip that her cousins teased her about. Her hair was thin, her chin retreated. She was tall and angular at a moment when fashion preferred soft and round. By the time she was 16, she had been told by aunts, governesses, dance instructors, and her own mother that she would have to be clever because she would never be looked at. The Guggenheim empire she was being measured against was vast. Her grandfather, Meyer Guggenheim, had arrived in Philadelphia from Switzerland in 1847 with almost nothing. He had sold lace and stove polish door to door, then opened a shop, then bought 2 silver mines outside Leadville, Colorado, in 1881 for around $5,000. By 1890, he had moved his 7 sons into the smelting business, the more profitable end of the mining trade. By 1901, the Guggenheim brothers controlled the American Smelting and Refining Company. By 1905, they controlled the Chuquicamata copper mine in Chile, one of the largest open pit mines in the world. By the time Peggy was 20, the family was estimated to be worth between $200 and $300 million in pre-inflation dollars. That figure, translated into modern money, sits somewhere between 6 and 9 billion. Only the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Astors were comparable. The wealth bought every kind of house. There was a townhouse at 3 East 72nd Street where Peggy grew up. There was a country estate at Sands Point on Long Island where her Uncle Solomon entertained European dealers and museum directors. There was a summer compound at Deal Beach on the New Jersey shore. There was an apartment in Paris where Benjamin had kept his secretary and the family had quietly known his mistress. There were railroad cars. There were yachts. There were eventually foundations and museums named after the brothers, but at the time Peggy was growing up, the family was still in the buying phase rather than the giving phase. The wealth did not buy social respectability. The Astor and Vanderbilt set, the so-called Mrs. Astor's 400, did not invite Guggenheims to dinner. The Guggenheims, like the Seligmans, the Lehmans, the Loebs, and the Schiffs, lived inside a parallel society called the 100. The 100 was Jewish, German-speaking at home, and almost entirely walled off from the Christian elite. The girls of the 100 came out at their own debutante balls, married within their own circle, and read the same novels and travel guides as the Astor daughters, but never attended the same dinners. Peggy felt the wall on both sides. The Christian elite would not have her. The 100 told her she was too tall and too ugly to be useful inside it. The story she would later tell about her teenage self was a story of escape attempts. At 15, she ran away to her aunt's house in Mount Kisco. At 16, she fell in love with a tennis instructor. At 17, she refused to come out at a private ball, then was forced into a ball at the Plaza Hotel by her mother. At 18, she enrolled in a finishing school in Massachusetts and was almost expelled for talking too freely about books her teachers did not know existed. At 19, through a friend, she took an unpaid position at the Sunwise Turn, a small bookshop on East 31st Street, run by 2 women who would change her life. The bookshop sold modernist writing and modernist art. She met, through the Sunwise Turn, Marsden Hartley, Marianne Moore, Lola Ridge, and a young architect named Laurence Vail. But the decisive humiliation came in the autumn of 1920, when she was 21 years old. She had decided, before her trip to Europe, to have her nose fixed. She booked an operation in Cincinnati with a surgeon known for the procedure. The technology of cosmetic surgery in 1920 was primitive. The surgeon used what was essentially a chisel. The pain was so severe that Peggy, mid-procedure, made him stop. She went home with her nose worse than before. For the rest of her life, she joked that her nose was a barometer. It changed shape, she said, with the weather. The joke was the armor. The wound was permanent. The money in her trust by then was finally accessible. Around $22,500 in annual income, which today is roughly $400,000 a year. It was not enough to maintain a Fifth Avenue townhouse. It was not enough to keep up with her cousins. But it was enough to live anywhere in Europe in great comfort. And so, in the late autumn of 1920, with her nose still healing, she booked a passage to Paris. She told no one at the family dinner table what she planned to do there. The truth was, she did not yet know. Chapter 3. She bought a one-way ticket to Paris. In 1920, she boarded a transatlantic liner with a small inheritance, a few French sentences, and an idea that respectable people did not survive. She was 22 years old. She wore a hat she had bought on Fifth Avenue that she would replace within a week of arrival. She had a single steamer trunk of clothes that she had selected herself. Her mother was not on the dock. Her sisters were not on the dock. Florette had sent a chauffeur. Peggy waved from the rail to a city she would not live in again for more than 20 years. The Paris she sailed into was already legendary by 1920. The war had ended 2 years earlier. The Treaty of Versailles had reshaped the map of Europe. The exchange rate had collapsed in favor of the dollar, which meant a young American with a trust fund could rent a hotel room near the Boulevard Raspail for the price of a sandwich in New York. The boulevards were full of demobilized soldiers, returning expatriates, refugees from the Russian Revolution, and the first wave of American writers and painters arriving to claim their cheap rooms. Gertrude Stein was already at 27 Rue de Fleurus. Sylvia Beach had just opened Shakespeare and Company. James Joyce was finishing Ulysses in an apartment that smelled of cigarettes. Man Ray was photographing everyone he could persuade to sit still. Peggy moved into a small flat on the left bank. She enrolled in French lessons. She ate at the Dôme and the Rotonde, the cafes where every American in the neighborhood ate. She paid for other people's drinks because she could, and because they were poorer than her, and because she had no other way of breaking into a circle that did not want a Guggenheim. The drinks at first did the work. She found herself within months in the same rooms as Marcel Duchamp, the French painter who had stopped painting and turned to chess and to making the strangest objects anyone had ever called art. Duchamp would later become her friend, her confidant, her advisor. In 1920, he was simply a charming Frenchman who did not laugh at her nose. She also found her first serious lover, Laurence Vail. Vail was an American sculptor, writer, and dada provocateur who lived in Paris on a small allowance from his expatriate parents. He was 3 years older than Peggy. He had thick blonde hair, a heavy jaw, and the dangerous attractiveness of a man who has not yet learned where the edge of a room is. He had been at Yale. He had been to war as an ambulance driver. He spoke fluent French. He drank from the moment he woke up. He was, in 1921, the unofficial king of Bohemia in Montparnasse, and he chose Peggy out of every American in the neighborhood. She believed naively that he had chosen her for her mind. He had chosen her in part for her trust fund. Their affair started in the summer of 1921. Within 6 months, he had proposed. Florette Guggenheim, contacted by telegram, refused her permission. Peggy was 23. She did not need permission. They married in March 1922 at the office of the American consul in Paris. Mina Loy was a witness. Man Ray took photographs. The reception was held at a cafe and broke up at 4 in the morning when Vail threw a champagne bottle through a window. For about 3 years, before the violence began in any serious way, Peggy was happy. She was in love with the man and with the city. She was inside the world that had refused to admit her grandfather. She walked into Picasso's studio on the Boulevard Raspail one afternoon and was introduced by Vail as a sculptor's wife. Picasso was bored that day. He did not look at her closely. She did not yet have the money or the courage to buy what he was showing. She gave birth to her first child, a son they named Michael Cedric Sinbad Vail, in May 1923 at a clinic outside Paris. The labor was long. Vail was not in the room. He arrived 17 hours later, drunk and pleased. 2 years later, she gave birth to a daughter, Pegeen, in Ouchy, Switzerland. Vail was in the room this time. He was sober. He held the baby for 15 minutes and then went out to the cafe across the road. The Paris of 1924 to 1927, the period the surviving photographs show most often, was Peggy at her gleaming peak as a young heiress in Europe. She wore poiré and patou. She bought her hats on the Rue Cambon. She kept a small bohemian car with which she terrified pedestrians. She gave dinners for Mina Loy and Berenice Abbott. She met Ernest Hemingway, Robert McCalman, Juna Barnes, and Hart Crane. She slept with most of them, at least once. The bohemian Paris of the legend had taken her in, the way it had taken in nobody from her cousin's set. And for those 4 years, she believed she had escaped. She had not. She had only moved the cage to a city where the bars had French names. The man she had married had hands that, when the drink hit a certain point in the evening, would not stay open. The wealth she had escaped to Paris with would, for the next 7 years, mostly pay for his bar tabs. And the Guggenheim name, which she had thought she could leave behind on a pier in New York, would follow her down every café in Montparnasse, because the waiter, the painter, the lover, the policeman, and the in-laws who eventually came to visit all noticed. She was not just Mrs. Vail, she was the Guggenheim. The trust fund had crossed the Atlantic with her, and so had the title. Chapter 4. The Husband Who Smashed Her Against the Walls. Laurence Vail was the most charming man in Montparnasse, and the first time he hit her, she was already pregnant. The incident was at the Café du Dôme in the autumn of 1922. Vail had been drinking absinthe with a friend for 6 hours. Peggy, who was in the 3rd month of her first pregnancy, asked him to come home. He answered by sweeping her glass off the table, grabbing her hair, and dragging her face downward into the ashtray. The waiter pulled him off. The waiter was tipped to forget. Peggy went home alone in a taxi. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell anyone for some years. The pattern was already set on the first night. Vail would drink. Vail would become incoherent. Vail would target Peggy because Peggy was the nearest available object in any room. He would hit her, throw her shoes out of the hotel window, throw her hats out of the hotel window, pour wine into her hair, smear jam onto her hair, hold her underwater in the bath until she gasped, and on one occasion, stub a lit cigarette out on the soft skin of her inner arm. The bruises were photographed in a private way by Berenice Abbott in a session that has never been published. Friends, including Mina Loy, the painter Florence Henry, and the writer Mary Reynolds, witnessed at least 3 episodes between 1923 and 1927. None of them intervened. The bohemian etiquette of Montparnasse held that a husband's habits were his own affair. Why did Peggy stay? The answer is the same answer it always is in these cases, with 2 specific Guggenheim variations. The first is that, for an heiress of her exact social position, divorce was almost as visible a failure as the marriage itself. To divorce Vail meant to return, with 2 small children, to a New York that would treat her as a cautionary tale. Her sisters and her mother would close ranks. Her uncles would shake their heads. The townhouse on East 72nd Street would have to receive her. But in receiving her, it would also remind her, every day, that she had failed at the one task a Guggenheim daughter had been assigned. The second variation is more personal. She believed at 24 and 25 that the man she had married was a genius. She believed his sculptures and his writing would eventually mean something. She believed his violence was the rage of a thwarted artist. She did not believe she could survive without his Paris, which was also her Paris, because she did not yet know that Paris would receive her without him. The children grew up inside the marriage like passengers on a runaway carriage. Sinbad, the son, born in 1923, was a quiet boy who learned by the age of 3 to leave the room when his father's voice changed pitch. Pegeen, the daughter, born in 1925, was a beautiful child with thick brown hair and an unsettled gaze. From the moment she could speak, she was caught in the gravity of her parents' war. Vail used Pegeen as a weapon against Peggy. He would refuse to let Peggy take her daughter to England or to Switzerland for the summers. Peggy used Pegeen as a refuge from Vail. She would scoop the child up and disappear to her cousin's villa in Promiscuer for weeks. The child grew up shuttled between hotels, governesses, and family villas. By the age of 7, Pegeen had already lived in 17 different addresses. The financial drain was constant. Vail wrote, but did not publish much. Vail sculpted, but did not sell. Vail entertained. Vail bought rounds. Vail purchased a small white car and crashed it within a month. Peggy estimated in her memoir that the marriage cost her approximately $15,000 a year in net allowance, on top of the children's expenses, on top of the hotels, on top of the cost of replacing the windows he kept breaking. By 1927, her trust was being chipped away at a rate that, if continued, would have left her with nothing to retire on by the age of 50. Then, in 1927, the marriage cracked open along an entirely different line. Peggy's elder sister Benita died in childbirth in Cincinnati on August 19th. Benita was 32 years old. The infant son was stillborn. Peggy was in Paris when the telegram came. She locked herself in the bedroom of the flat on the Avenue Raye for 2 days. She would not eat. She would not let Vail in. When she came out, she had decided 2 things. The first was that she would have one more child by Vail, in honor of Benita. The second was that she would, when the right escape presented itself, leave him. The third child never came. Peggy miscarried twice in 1928. The escape presented itself in the form of an Englishman she met in Saint-Tropez in the summer of 1928, at the house of the painter Mary Reynolds. His name was John Holmes. He was a 30-year-old former cavalry officer with a distinguished service order from the war, a stalled writing career, a passionate intelligence, and an alcohol problem that already, in 1928, equaled Vail's. He was, by every account, the most charismatic conversationalist anyone in Bohemia had met. The poet Edwin Muir said of him that he was the only man whose speech he would have crossed a continent to hear. Peggy, who had spent 6 years inside Laurence Vail's intelligence, understood within an hour that Holmes was the smarter man. By the spring of 1929, she had moved out of the flat she shared with Vail. The separation, when it came, was violent. Vail broke into the new flat with an axe and demolished a door. The Paris police were called. They did nothing, because Vail was Vail, and Peggy was Peggy. And Bohemia did not press charges. She and Holmes took a long holiday in the south of France with the children. They settled in the autumn in a house called Hayford Hall in Devon, England. It was a damp country house with 30 rooms. They stayed for 4 years. The drinking continued. So did the children. So did the writing he could not seem to finish. For Peggy, the Hayford Hall years were the closest she ever came to a settled life with a man. She believed she had finally chosen well. She had escaped a violent husband. She had found a man who looked at her with respect. She had a daughter old enough to ride a pony. She had her own kitchen, her own books, and a man who did not throw her shoes out of windows. She was, at last, on the inside of a marriage that did not feel like an ambush. She did not yet know that John Farrar Holmes had 18 months left to live. Chapter 5. The only man she truly loved died drunk. On an operating table. John Farrar Holmes was a war hero who could not write a sentence, and he was the love of Peggy's life. He had been a captain in the Royal Lancers. He had won the Distinguished Service Order at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 for an action so violent that the citation, when it appeared, used the phrase "conspicuous gallantry under appalling conditions." After the war, he tried intermittently to write a novel. He wrote, by his own account, the first chapter 10 times in a decade. He could not get past the first chapter. He drank instead. Peggy and Holmes lived together from 1928 until December 1934. The first 2 years were in France and Italy. The next 4 were at Hayford Hall in Devon, the rambling stone house Peggy rented from the estate of a deceased Edwardian banker. The grounds were 13 acres. The drawing room ceiling was 16 feet high. There were no electric lights in 1929. The fires were lit by a man named Sutton, who arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 8 in the evening. The children, Sinbad and Pegeen, had a governess and a tutor, and were allowed to run through the woods unsupervised in the afternoons. Vail, by court arrangement, took them for half of every year. The other half they spent under their mother's eye, watching their mother watch the man she now slept beside. What was Holmes like? In the years Peggy loved him. He was thin, dark-haired, and physically lazy in a way the war had made him. He had hands that were beautiful when sober, and unreliable when drunk. He could quote Dante and Shakespeare and Coleridge in long passages. He could win any argument in any room. He could not get out of bed before noon. He could not finish a paragraph. He was the kind of failure that Bohemia made room for. Peggy supported him entirely. She paid for the rent. She paid for the wine. She paid for the cigarettes. She paid for the trips to London and to Paris and to Italy. She told everyone he was a great man whose work had not yet arrived. The relationship had a quality that her marriage to Vail had never had. They talked. They argued without violence. They read the same books at the same time. Holmes helped Peggy, in conversations that lasted through the night, sort out what she actually thought about art, money, politics, religion, and her own family. He was the first person who had ever taken her ideas seriously rather than her checkbook. For Peggy, who had been told from childhood that she was not pretty enough to be loved for her body, and who had now learned that she was rich enough to be loved for her money, the experience of being loved for what she said was a revelation. She would refer to him for the rest of her life as the man she had loved most completely. She meant it, but the drinking was relentless. Holmes drank a bottle of red wine before lunch, a second bottle with lunch, and a brandy in the afternoon to settle the headaches. By 1933 he could not climb the stairs at Hayford Hall without resting at the landing. His skin was yellowing. His teeth were going. He had developed a tremor in his hands that prevented him from holding a pen. The first chapter of the novel sat on his desk, 11 pages, unfinished. He talked in the late evenings of leaving for Spain with Peggy, leaving for India, leaving for anywhere the climate would help. He did not leave. In December 1934, they were preparing to spend Christmas in London. Holmes had injured his wrist falling against a stone wall during a riding accident at Hayford Hall a few weeks earlier. The wrist had set badly. A surgeon in London advised a minor procedure to re-break and reset the bone. The procedure was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a small clinic in Bloomsbury. Holmes was given chloroform. He had drunk a bottle of red wine at lunch. His heart stopped under the chloroform. He was 37 years old. The death certificate noted that the cause was anesthetic complications combined with severe alcoholic damage to the liver and heart. Peggy was in the waiting room. The surgeon came out to tell her, then could not get the words out, and she understood from his face. She sat for 40 minutes in the chair in the hall, outside the operating room, without moving. She did not cry until she was in the taxi. Then she cried for 2 days. The grief, when she would later try to describe it, was unlike any other loss in her life. With her father, she had lost a stranger she had imagined into a hero. With her sister Benita, she had lost the only person who had loved her without conditions. With Holmes, she had lost the only person who had loved her with conditions and chosen her anyway. He had seen her, fully, and stayed. The replacement of that recognition by absence was the wound that, in her own later writing, never closed. What did the death do to her? For one thing, it removed the last domestic anchor she had ever managed to construct. The lease on Hayford Hall was given up. The children were dispatched to Vail and to school. Peggy moved to London for several months, then back to France. She drank more. She began an affair with the English communist writer and publisher Douglas Garman that would last for almost 3 years. Garman was a different kind of man, ideological, controlled, often absent. He left her in 1937 to return to full-time party work. For another thing, the death pushed her, finally, into a decision about the rest of her life. She was 36 years old. She had been in Europe for 14 years. She had spent enormous amounts of money on bohemian husbands and lovers, with very little to show for any of it. She had no profession. She had no settled home. She had 2 small children who were being raised in shifts. She had mostly a self-destructive pattern she could no longer pretend was anyone else's responsibility. It was Vail's sister Clotilde, of all people, who said the sentence that changed her mind. Clotilde, who had loved Holmes too, asked Peggy at a dinner in Paris in the spring of 1937 what she planned to do now. Peggy said she did not know. Clotilde said she should open a gallery. The advice came out of nowhere and lodged. Peggy had been to galleries in London for years. She had been bored by most of them. She had been buying books and rare editions from a friend named Wynne Henderson, who ran a small London printing press. She had a circle that included Marcel Duchamp, Roland Penrose, and the surrealist writers who could not get their work seen. She had a small but real income. She had a daughter who would soon need a flat in a city. In the autumn of 1937, she rented a small space at 30 Cork Street in London. She painted the walls white. She hired Wynne Henderson to manage the office. She named the gallery Guggenheim Jeune. The Jeune was a play on her Uncle Solomon's name. The implication, which she enjoyed enormously, was that there was now a younger and more modern Guggenheim in the art world. The uncle in New York did not find it amusing. Peggy did not care. On January 24, 1938, Guggenheim Jeune opened its first show, a retrospective of the works of Jean Cocteau. Cocteau himself sent 2 drawings that were impounded by British customs as obscene. Peggy successfully argued in writing that the drawings were art. The press noticed. The gallery had its first review. The new career had begun. She would later say of those years, that she opened the gallery not because she had ever planned to be a dealer, but because John Holmes had died, and she had to put the money he was not spending somewhere. The line, in her memoir, sounds like a joke. It was not entirely a joke. That's Chapter 6. 12 Nights with Samuel Beckett. On Boxing Day, 1939, at a Paris dinner party held by James Joyce, an Irish writer 12 years younger than her changed her mind about everything. His name was Samuel Beckett. He was 33. He had pale eyes, a long, awkward body, and a manner so quiet that he could sit through an entire meal without speaking. He worked irregularly as a translator and a secretary. He had published one novel that no one had read, and a small collection of stories that no one had bought. He lived in a hotel room on the Rue des Favorites. He was, in December 1939, possibly the least famous man at the dinner. Peggy was 41. She was in Paris because the gallery in London had been a critical success, but a financial failure, and she had begun to plan, on Marcel Duchamp's advice, a transition from a gallery to a museum. She had a list of artists, drawn up with Duchamp, and the American art historian Howard Putzel, of every painter and sculptor whose work would have to be in the eventual permanent collection. She had cash. She had time. Paris in December 1939 was a strange and quiet place. The war had been declared 3 months earlier. The French army was in the field. The Germans had not yet attacked. The phony war, as it was called, had emptied the cafes of young men. Joyce and his wife Nora had invited Peggy because she had been one of the few private patrons who had reliably bought Joyce's books in their first editions, and because Joyce, ailing and almost blind, was returning some of the kindness. Beckett, who had been Joyce's secretary in the early 1930s and was an informal member of the Joyce household, was at the table because Joyce liked him. The flirtation between Peggy and Beckett started across the soup. They left the table at midnight together. They walked through the deserted Trocadero in the dark. They went back to her hotel, the Crillon. They stayed in the bedroom for almost 48 hours. Peggy would later count, with characteristic precision, that they made love 7 times and drank 3 bottles of champagne. Then Beckett went back to his hotel for a clean shirt. He returned the next afternoon. The affair lasted, by her own count, 12 nights, with 2 short interruptions. What did they talk about in those 12 nights, between the lovemaking and the cigarettes? They talked about art. Peggy described, with growing confidence, her plan for the museum collection. She listed the artists she had on her wall list: Picasso, Leger, Mondrian, Brancusi, Tanguy, Ernst, Klee, the Surrealists, the Cubists, the great names of the older generation. Beckett heard her out, and then said the sentence that altered the trajectory of her life. "Buy the living ones," he said. "The old ones can take care of themselves. The new ones cannot. Patronage means money to the people who need it now." It was a small, almost obvious thing to say, but it was said by a man she trusted intellectually more than she trusted any of her advisors, and it landed because, until that night, Peggy's instinct had been the opposite. She had been buying primarily older European modernism, the safe pre-war canon, the Picasso etchings, and the Leger drawings. The advice from Beckett pushed her toward the surrealists and toward the abstract experimentalists who had not yet found a market. It pushed her toward Mondrian's late white paintings, toward Brancusi's polished bronzes, toward the work that was actively being made in 1939 and 40. By the end of the second week of their affair, Beckett had returned, awkwardly and unhappily, to his French partner, Suzanne Deschavaux-Duménil. The reasons were Beckett's reasons. He had a quiet domestic life with Suzanne that suited him. He was not in love with Peggy in the way she wanted him to be. He told her, in a small flat on the Rue des Favoris in the second week of January 1940, that he could not leave Suzanne. Peggy accepted it. She did not press. She had learned by then, when a man was speaking his mind. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. He would later see her in Venice. He would write her warm letters from Paris. He never apologized. She never asked him to. What Peggy did instead, with the bruise of his absence fresh, was act on his advice. By February 1940, she had relocated permanently to Paris. She had taken a flat on the Ile Saint-Louis. She had Marcel Duchamp at her elbow most days. She had Howard Putzel running between studios for her. She had a list of works she wanted. She had cash in dollars, which was now worth twice what it had been against the franc because the war was eating the French currency. She set a target, one major work a day, for as long as the buying held. She walked into the studios. The artists were broke. The galleries were closing. The wealthy collectors were emptying their walls and heading for Lisbon. Peggy was almost the only buyer with cash who was actually still buying. The prices were absurd by pre-war standards. She paid $400 for paintings that had cost $2,000 a year earlier. She paid $500 for sculptures by Brancusi that today are valued at tens of millions. She bought a Léger called L'Homme dans la Ville for $1,000. She bought a Brancusi bird in space in polished bronze. She bought Mondrian's late grid paintings. She bought Tanguy. She bought Magritte. She bought a Dali. She bought an Ernst. She bought a Klee. She bought a Picabia. She walked into Picasso's studio twice. The second time, he was less bored. She bought a study he had been planning to sell to a Swiss collector who had not paid. By May 10, 1940, when the Germans invaded the Low Countries and the war began in earnest, Peggy had spent approximately $40,000 and had acquired more than 100 works. The collection she had assembled in those 6 months in Paris with the artists fleeing around her would later be valued at between $200 million and $1 billion. It is one of the strangest single financial events in the history of patronage. She had a list. She had cash. She walked. She bought. She did not pause. She did not ask whether the artist's reputation would survive the war. She did not check with her cousins. She moved. The point of no return came that May. She had to get the collection out of France. She approached the Louvre, which had been quietly evacuating its own collection to country chateaux for months. She asked whether her 100 works could be packed alongside the Louvre's masterpieces. The Louvre's committee of curators considered her list. They sent her a letter, signed by a senior administrator, declining her request on the grounds that her works were not, in their view, of sufficient artistic importance to merit protection. Peggy kept that letter for the rest of her life. She framed it. She showed it to visitors at the Palazzo in Venice as a reminder. The institution that today defines the canon of European art had told her, in writing, that Picasso, Brancusi, Léger, and Mondrian were not worth saving. She made her own arrangements. She had the paintings packed as household goods, lampshades, bed linen, and pots. She shipped them, at substantial bribes, through Marseille to Lisbon to New York. By the time the trunks arrived in America in 1941, France had fallen. The Louvre's curators had begun, by then, to defend their own works against German requisition. Peggy's collection had crossed the Atlantic. She would shortly cross it herself. Chapter 7. A Painting. A Day. As the Nazis came, she bought one Brancusi, one Léger, one Tanguy, one Picasso, one a day, while the city around her packed for the trains south. The chronology of that spring is worth slowing down on, because almost nothing else in the history of 20th century patronage compresses so much into so few weeks. The phony war ended on May 10, 1940, when German tanks crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands. Within 2 weeks, the French government was preparing to leave Paris. The British had begun the Dunkirk evacuation on May 26th. The German army reached the outskirts of Paris on June 12th. The French government formally evacuated the city on June 10th, declaring it an open city to spare it bombardment. The Germans entered Paris on June 14th. Marshal Pétain signed the armistice on June 22nd in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. France was divided into an occupied northern zone and a Vichy southern zone. Almost every Jewish citizen, every artist on the Nazi list of degenerate art, every communist, every refugee was suddenly running for the south or for the Spanish border. In the middle of all of this, Peggy Guggenheim was buying paintings. By her own account, in the few weeks between the German breakthrough at the Meuse and the fall of Paris, she purchased an additional 20 works. Her flat on the Ile Saint-Louis was full of canvases stacked against the walls. Marcel Duchamp came in and out, advising. Howard Putzel had already fled to America in late May. Peggy was running her own logistics now. The list she had assembled by the time she packed up was extraordinary. From the Cubist period, she had a Picasso oil from 1911 and Léger's Les Hommes dans la Ville. From the early Surrealist period, she had multiple Ernst canvases, several Magritte oils, 2 Dailies, and a Tanguy. From the abstract movement, she had Mondrian, Kandinsky, and several Mirots. From the sculpture catalog she had Brancusi, Calder, and Giacometti. From the contemporary surrealists she had Delvaux, Masson, and Lamb. The collection was not yet famous because it was still in her flat, but it was on paper already one of the most important private holdings of European modernism on either side of the Atlantic. The departure was complicated by her insistence on bringing not only the art, but also her family and her closest friends. By June 1940, she had assembled around the Ile Saint Louis flat, a small refugee group that included her 2 children, Sinbad and Pegeen, her ex-husband Laurence Vail, and his second wife Kay Boyle, and their children, Max Ernst, whom she had not yet married but had agreed to help escape, the British art critic Mary Reynolds, and several others. The group totaled at the peak 16 adults and children. Peggy was paying for almost all of them. She had also acquired, by sheer determination, the necessary American visas, French exit permits, Spanish transit visas, and Portuguese transit visas to move that group from Paris to Lisbon and then onto a ship. Max Ernst was the most difficult member of the group to move. He had been interned by the French as an enemy alien at the start of the war, released, interned again, and then released. He was on the Nazi list of degenerate artists. If the Germans caught him, he would almost certainly be sent to a camp. Peggy had met Ernst formally in 1938 when she had bought one of his canvases. By 1940, she had purchased a substantial number of his works. She agreed that summer that the simplest way to get him to America was to marry him on arrival, which would entitle him to an American visa under family unification. Ernst was 12 years older than Peggy. He was already in love with the young American painter Dorothea Tanning, whom he had met in New York earlier that year, but he agreed to the marriage. The arrangement was understood by both of them as a rescue. Neither of them at the time called it love. In the middle of June, the group left Paris for the country in 2 cars. They drove south, slowly, against the tide of French refugees. They stopped at a chateau near Avignon. The collection, meanwhile, had been packed and crated under the disguise of household goods. The lampshades and pots and bed linen story was technically true. The paintings were inside the crates with the linen. Peggy paid a series of bribes that she was careful, in her later writing, to document precisely. She paid $200 to a customs official in Marseille. She paid $150 to a Spanish border official. She paid $1,000 in total to a Portuguese shipping agent for forged manifests. By March 1941, after a complicated overland route through Vichy, France, Spain, and Portugal, the group arrived in Lisbon. The collection had been shipped separately and was already by then en route to New York via a freighter. The group flew in 3 separate stages on a Pan-American clipper from Lisbon to New York. They arrived on July 14, 1941. The collection was delivered to her sister Hazel's house in Connecticut a few weeks later. The paintings were unpacked among the lampshades and the bed linen. The pots had to be cleaned of paint. Nothing had been damaged. Peggy and Max Ernst were married on December 30th, 1941, in a registry office in Manhattan. The witness was Howard Putzel. Ernst wore a corduroy jacket. Peggy wore a hat with a large red feather. The marriage was, on paper, the rescue arrangement they had agreed on in France. In practice, for the first 18 months, it was also a real marriage. They lived together in a townhouse on East 51st Street in New York. They went to openings together. They argued about money. They argued about Dorothea Tanning, who lived in Sedona, Arizona, and who Ernst visited as often as he could find a reason. Peggy understood, by the early autumn of 1942, that her marriage was already over, in fact, even if the legal paperwork would take another 4 years to finalize. But the marriage was, on her side, almost incidental to what she was now doing in New York. She had been thinking, since her conversation with Duchamp in early 1941, about how to display the collection. Renting a few rooms and putting the paintings on the walls was not enough. She wanted a museum. She wanted the museum to be a statement. She hired the Austrian architect Friedrich Kiesler to design a permanent gallery on the 3rd floor of a building at 30 West 57th Street. Kiesler was a visionary. Nobody else would have hired for a New York gallery. He designed convex curving walls upholstered in heavy curtains. He designed paintings on baseball bat-shaped arms that swung out from the walls. He designed viewing devices that required the visitor to crank a handle to see a small Klee enlarged. He designed turning seats and shifting light schemes. The space looked like a surrealist nightmare and a science fiction set at once. It cost roughly $7,000, all of it Peggy's money. It opened on October 20th, 1942, under the name Art of This Century. The opening was the social event of the New York art world that autumn. The press, including the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, sent critics. The collectors of the older European canon were horrified. The young American painters who had not yet had their first show were stunned. Peggy stood in the middle of it in butterfly-shaped sunglasses and a green dress, with one earring shaped like a calder and the other shaped like a tangi. She had brought one of the great collections of European modernism to America. She had built a gallery that no one had seen the like of. She was, that night, the most important woman in the New York art world. Chapter 8. She married Max Ernst to get him out of a camp. Max Ernst was on the Nazi list of degenerate artists, and he married Peggy to obtain a passport, and he told her so. The marriage in December 1941 was, for both of them, a transaction with a thin overlay of affection. The transaction worked. Ernst entered the United States as the husband of an American citizen. He was given a visa, then permanent residency. He survived the war. He produced in his New York and Arizona years some of the most important paintings of his career. Without Peggy, he would almost certainly have been arrested in Marseille in the autumn of 1940. The deal she made was, by any reasonable measure, the most consequential personal rescue any private patron of modern art ever conducted. But the deal also broke her. Slowly, across the 4 years they were married. Ernst was 12 years older than Peggy. He had been famous in Europe since the early 1920s, when he had helped invent collage as a surrealist medium with his series La Femme 100 Tate. He had been the most influential painter at the Cologne Dada exhibition of 1920. He had been a founding member of the Paris Surrealist group. He had been married twice. He had a son, Jimmy, by his first wife. He arrived in America in 1941 with a reputation that Peggy, despite her gallery, could not match. He treated her, from the first weeks of the marriage, as a useful but ultimately replaceable woman. The signs were everywhere. He went to Sedona, Arizona, every 6 weeks to see Dorothea Tanning, whose work he was beginning to promote in New York. He told friends at parties where Peggy could hear him that he had married Peggy only because of the visa. He shared a bed with her irregularly. He was kind to her children, in a distant way, and indifferent to her family. He took money from her for paint and canvas without thanking her. He used her gallery as his exhibition platform, without acknowledging her as more than the gallerist. Peggy, in her memoir, was almost brutally honest about it. She wrote that she had known, by the end of 1942, that the marriage was a humiliation. She also wrote that she could not bear to lose him, because losing him would mean acknowledging that she had, again, chosen wrong. She stayed in the marriage another 3.5 years. She held openings at Art of This Century with Ernst as the headline name. She did not protest publicly when he went to Arizona. She drank too much. She slept with other men, including a young Englishman whose identity she protected in her memoir, in part as a private rebalancing. But while the marriage was disintegrating, the gallery was making history. Art of This Century, in the 4 years it existed at 30 West, 57th Street, became one of the single most important commercial galleries of the 20th century. Peggy curated and showed 24 major exhibitions between October 1942 and the spring of 1947. She showed in those exhibitions the now familiar pantheon of European modernism. She also showed, for the first time anywhere with any seriousness, an emerging group of American painters who would later be called the abstract expressionists. The discovery that mattered most, both to her and to the future of American art, was Jackson Pollock. Pollock was a 30-year-old American painter from Wyoming who had been working in obscurity in New York for a decade. He had a drinking problem that already, in 1943, equaled most of the worst Peggy had known. He had a wife, the painter Lee Krasner, who managed his career with ferocious skill. He had been recommended to Peggy by Howard Putzel and by the painter Piet Mondrian, who had told her in 1942, after looking at one of Pollock's early canvases at her gallery, that the young American was the most exciting new painter in the country. Peggy organized Pollock's first one-man show at Art of This Century in November 1943. The show received mixed reviews. The painter Clement Greenberg, then a young critic, wrote a defense of Pollock that began the process of establishing his reputation. Peggy followed up the show with the move that mattered most. She offered Pollock a contract. He would receive $150 a month as a stipend. In return, she would have the right to all the paintings he produced over a 5-year period, with deductions for the value of any she chose to keep beyond an agreed quota. The contract sounds modest. In the context of 1943, it was career-making. $150 a month was enough to live on, modestly, in New York. It freed Pollock from his odd jobs. It allowed him to paint full-time. It paid the rent on his and Krasner's tiny apartment. It gave him the financial stability that had eluded him through the entire Depression. The paintings he produced under that contract included the first strip paintings of 1947, the breakthrough images that would later define mid-century American art. The estimated value of the works Peggy received under the Pollock contract, in modern terms, is between $50 million and $200 million. She paid, over 5 years, approximately $9,000 for them. She also showed Mark Rothko, who had his first one-man show at her gallery in January 1945. She showed Robert Motherwell, who had his first one-man show at the gallery in October 1944. She showed Clifford Still, who had his first one-man show at the gallery in February 1946. She showed William Bazzi Oates, who had his first one-man show at the gallery in October 1944. The roll call is staggering. The 4 major founding figures of abstract expressionism, plus Pollock, all had their first solo shows at the same gallery, with the same patron, within 24 months of each other. The Ernst marriage, meanwhile, was crumbling. By the autumn of 1943, Ernst had effectively moved his life to Arizona to be with Dorothea Tanning. He returned to New York periodically. The visits were short and increasingly cold. Peggy continued to share legal residence with him because divorcing him would have been a public admission of failure, and because the legal process was complicated by his immigration status. She did not insist. She concentrated on the gallery. The Ernst marriage ended legally in 1946. The divorce papers were filed quietly. Ernst married Dorothea Tanning later the same year. Peggy attended none of the post-divorce social events. She bought herself a new car, a small Citroen, and named it the Ernst as a private joke. She drove it for 2 years before selling it for parts. The joke, like the nose joke, was the armor. The wound, like the nose, was real. By the spring of 1947, Peggy had been in New York for almost 6 years. The gallery had made history. The marriage was over. Her children were almost grown. She was 48 years old. She was tired. She was also, she realized in the spring of 47, fundamentally not at home in America. The country she had returned to in 1941 was not the country she had left in 1920. She had spent her formative adulthood in Paris, London, and Devon. She missed Europe. She missed the cafes, the river light, the conversations that did not assume she should explain herself. She announced the closure of Art of this Century in May 1947. The final exhibition, a small show of new work by Theo van Doesburg, closed in June. She packed up the European works that had not yet been sold. She arranged for the storage of the Pollocks she still owned. She boarded a passenger ship for Genoa, alone, on the last day of June. She had decided on her own where she was going to go. She was going to Venice. It's on Chapter 9. The Daughter Who Died. At 41. Pegeen Vail. Guggenheim was found dead in her Paris apartment on March 1, 1967, surrounded by empty bottles, and her mother never forgave herself or anyone else. The date was a Wednesday. The apartment was on the Rue de l'Université in the 7th arrondissement. The death was discovered by her second husband, the British painter Ralph Rumney, who had been separated from her for some weeks, and who had returned to collect a coat. The official cause of death, listed on the certificate by a French police doctor, was accidental barbiturate intoxication. The drug was Nembutal. The dosage was not consistent with a single pill. The empty bottles were on the bedside table and on the floor. The apartment was otherwise tidy. Pegeen was 41. She had 4 sons. She was a painter of modest but real talent. She had been depressed for at least 17 years. To understand the wound of that death, the story has to be wound back to the child she had been. Pegeen was born in 1925 in Ouchy, Switzerland, the second child of Peggy and Laurence Vail. From birth, she had been beautiful in a way that her mother was not. She had dark curling hair, large eyes, a soft chin. She was, by every account of her babyhood, an unusually quiet and watchful child. By the time she could speak, she had already been taught, by the rhythms of her parents' war, to listen for the change in tone that meant a room was about to become dangerous. Her childhood was logistically chaotic. By the age of 7, she had lived, as previously noted, in 17 different addresses. She had been shuttled between her father's homes and her mother's homes, between France, England, Switzerland, and Italy, between the violent house of Vail and the slightly less violent house of Holmes, between governesses she did not know and tutors who came and went. She formed a profound attachment to her older brother Sinbad, who was a steady child 2 years older and her closest friend through their entire childhood. Sinbad and Pegeen, in adult life, were each other's principal anchors. Her mother, by every account including her own, was inattentive. Peggy was not a cruel mother. She was a distracted mother. She loved her daughter genuinely, in the way she loved her dogs and her paintings, intensely, but not steadily. She frequently left Pegeen with governesses for weeks at a time. She criticized her daughter's clothes. She told her, in front of guests, that her painting was promising but not original. She referred to Pegeen's boyfriends by category rather than by name. She married for the second time to Max Ernst, without consulting either of her children. She moved continents on her own schedule. She did, however, support Pegeen financially throughout her life, and she did include Pegeen's paintings in her museum exhibitions in Venice. Pegeen first showed signs of serious depression in her late teens, around 1943 while living with Peggy and Max Ernst in New York. The symptoms were withdrawn long periods, sudden tears in public, a refusal to eat for days. Her brother Sinbad had been sent to boarding school in Connecticut, and was not there to absorb the household pressure. The Ernst marriage was deteriorating around her. The Pollock contract had recently been signed, and Peggy was at the gallery from morning until midnight. Pegeen, at 18, was largely alone. She married, at the age of 20, the French painter Jean Holms. The marriage took place in 1946 in Paris, just as Peggy's own marriage to Ernst was ending. Holms was a respected painter, 21 years older than Pegeen, and a survivor of 2 years as a French prisoner of war in Germany. They had 3 sons together, Fabrice, David, and Nicolas, between 1947 and 1954. The marriage lasted 12 years. Holms was kind, but already entering the obsessive phase of his work that would dominate his 60s and 70s. He was not equipped to be the principal emotional support of a depressive wife. The marriage ended in 1958. Pegeen married Ralph Rumney in 1958. Rumney was a British painter and a founder of the Situationist International. He was 25 at the time of the marriage. Pegeen was 33. He was charismatic, politically radical, and unstable. The Vail family pattern, in other words, repeated itself across a generation. Peggy, who had married twice and chosen badly twice, watched her daughter marry twice and choose, by most measures, badly twice. The 4th son, Sandro, was born to Pegeen and Rumney in 1958. The relationship with Rumney was the immediate context of the death. Pegeen had separated from Rumney several weeks before March 1, 1967. The separation was reportedly her decision. Rumney had been heavily involved in the Paris cultural underground. He drank. He took amphetamines. He was, according to friends, frequently absent. The pattern was almost identical to her father's marriage, in the previous generation, to her mother. The grandchildren of Bohemia were repeating the grandparents, the death itself, the nembutol bottles, the tidy apartment, the painter husband who arrived in the early evening and found her, the Paris police who asked few questions, the body taken to a small mortuary, the cabled news to Venice. Peggy received the telegram at the Palazzo on the morning of March 2nd. Sinbad, who was in London, flew to Paris that afternoon. Peggy did not fly to Paris. She could not, she said, bear the city. Sinbad arranged the funeral. Peggy attended in a black coat that she would later say she would not wear again. The aftermath was the wound that did not close. Peggy fixed her grief, in the months and years afterward, on Ralph Rumney. She blamed him for the separation. She blamed him for the depression. She blamed him for, as she said in private, killing her daughter. She refused to see him. She refused to allow Sandro, his son with Pegeen, to be raised by him. She fought in Italian and French courts for the right to bring Sandro to Venice. Romney resisted. The custody battle lasted several years and was, by every account, ferocious. Peggy lost the custody battle. Sandro remained with his father. Peggy and Sandro reconciled partially in her last years, when he was a teenager. The wound remained. The wider grief was not focused on Romney, although the legal fight allowed her to express it. The wider grief was for her daughter, and for her own failure to be the mother she had not been. Peggy did not, in her surviving letters from the years after Pegeen's death, dwell on her own role. The few paragraphs she did write are brutal. She wrote to a friend in London that she should have known. She wrote to her brother-in-law that she had failed her. She wrote to her son, Sindbad, that she could not understand how she had allowed her daughter to live alone in Paris with a man who could not look after her. The letters are unusually short. Peggy, who could write for pages about her lovers and her paintings, could not write for paragraphs about her dead daughter. The silence in the letters is the loudest part of them. By the spring of 1968, 1 year after the death, Peggy had moved a small framed photograph of Pegeen from a private drawer in her bedroom to a public spot on the marble mantelpiece in the salon at the Palazzo. The photograph showed Pegeen at 20, in Paris, smiling. Visitors who knew the family did not ask about it. Peggy, who would normally tell the story of any object in the house, would, when a visitor's eyes lingered on the photograph, look away. She stopped buying art, with 1 or 2 minor exceptions, in 1967. The collection was complete. The daughter was gone. The mother sat by the canal in the long afternoons and watched the light. Chapter 10. The Palace That Bought Her Peace. She had bought a palace on the Grand Canal in 1949 for $60,000, and by the 1960s it was the only family she had left. The palace was the Palazzo Venier de Leoni. It sat on the left bank of the Canal Grande, between the Accademia and the Punta della Dogana. It was a single-story white building, low against the water, with a wide stone terrace facing the canal. It had been begun in 1749 by the Venier family, with the intention of becoming a 5-story palace that would rival the Tsar Redzonico across the water. The family had run out of money after the ground floor. The palace had sat unfinished for 200 years, with a tarpaulin where the upper floors should have been. Peggy bought it from the estate of an Italian noblewoman who had used the ground floor as a residence. The price, $60,000, was extraordinary even by post-war Venetian standards. The dollar was strong. The lira was weak. The Venetian aristocracy was selling. Peggy walked through the rooms once, decided in 20 minutes, and signed the papers within the week. She moved in permanently in the spring of 1949. She brought the European modernist collection, which had been in storage in New York. She brought the American works, including a group of Pollocks she had retained from the contract years. She brought the dogs, who arrived in a series of crates. She brought, eventually, 14 Lhasa Apsos, who lived with her through the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. She did not bring a husband. The Palazzo became, over the next 3 decades, the most photographed private home in Venice. It was photographed because Peggy was photographed. She walked the terrace in butterfly-shaped sunglasses. She wore the immense earrings made by Alexander Calder. She received the writers, painters, and curators who came through Venice, including Truman Capote, Saul Bellow, Tennessee Williams, John Cage, and Yoko Ono. She entertained the Queen of Denmark on one occasion. She kept a small gondola, painted black with a white interior, which by 1960 was the last privately owned gondola in the city. She was rowed up and down the canal by a single gondolier with 2 of the dogs at her feet, like a doge of an entirely fictional Venice that existed only for her. The collection was open to the public 3 afternoons a week. Tickets were free. Visitors who arrived during opening hours were sometimes greeted by Peggy herself, in a caftan, eating an orange. She would lead them through the rooms and tell stories about each painting. The Brancusi sculpture in the entrance hall, the Pollock above the dining room fireplace, the Calder mobile in the garden, the Magritte in the salon, the Picasso etchings in the back rooms. The personal narration was famous enough that visitors planned their trips to Venice to coincide with her opening hours. The garden became her own private burial ground for the dogs. Each Lhasa Apso, when it died, was buried in a small grave with a small stone marker bearing its name and dates. By the time of her own death, there were 14 graves. The names were Pegeen, Sir Herbert, Madame Butterfly, Madame Beethoven, Cappuccino, Peacock, Toro, Foglia, Hong Kong, Sable, Gypsy, Baby, White Angel, and Emily. The graves were arranged in 2 rows facing the canal. She visited them every afternoon when she could still walk. She told friends in the last years that her plot was reserved next to the dogs. The personal life inside the palazzo in those last decades was quieter than the press version. Peggy entertained constantly, but was often, in the photographs, the only person at the table holding still. She drank steadily, but not as heavily as in her 30s. She slept poorly. She read constantly. She kept up a correspondence with old friends, including Samuel Beckett, who wrote to her several times a year until her death. She fought with the Italian tax authorities for years over the museum's status and won, eventually, an exemption that would survive her. She negotiated over a decade with the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in New York for the eventual transfer of the collection. The negotiation with the foundation was the closing argument of her life. The foundation was run by descendants of her uncle Solomon, whom Peggy had spent her career embarrassing. The board would have preferred a quieter agreement. Peggy demanded specific guarantees. The collection would remain permanently in Venice, in the Palazzo, never move to New York. The museum would carry her name. Her ashes would be buried in the garden. The foundation, eventually and with grace, agreed to all of it. The agreement was signed in 1976. The Palazzo, by the late 1970s, had begun to feel like a museum, even when Peggy was alive in it. The line between the home and the institution had blurred. Visitors who came in the opening hours did not always realize that the woman with the orange was the owner. They walked through her bedroom, where one of her favorite Tanguy paintings hung above the bed. They walked through her bathroom, which was the only working bathroom on the main floor, and which she had grown tired of explaining to confused tourists. She did not mind. The art was the thing. The audience was the thing. She had become, in her own house, the curator and the wall label and the woman who lit the cigarettes between viewings. She wrote in her revised memoir that the Palazzo was the only relationship in her life that had not betrayed her. The building did not drink. The building did not leave. The building did not die before she did. It sat low and white on the canal, with the dogs in the garden and the paintings on the walls and the long afternoons that asked nothing. Heiress, Chapter 11. The memoir that made the Guggenheims sick. In 1946, she published a book that named her lovers, named the prices, and told the family how it had felt to be the ugly one. The book was called Out of This Century. It appeared from the Dial Press in New York in October. It was 370 pages long. It cost $3.75. It received an initial print run of 5,000 copies. Within 6 weeks, it had been reviewed in every major American newspaper. Within 6 months, it had been denounced by every member of the Guggenheim family who could be reached for comment. Within a year, copies were trading on the used book market for inflated prices because, the rumor ran, the family had hired agents to buy and destroy them. The rumor was at least partly true. Peggy's cousin, Harry Guggenheim, who had taken over the family aviation interests, reportedly authorized the purchase of every copy that could be found in New York bookshops in the autumn of 1946. The intent was containment. The result was the opposite. The book became impossible to find, then legendary, then read by everyone who could borrow a copy. What was in the book that scandalized so completely? The structure was simple. Peggy told her own life from her childhood in New York through the closure of Art of This Century. She named her father's mistress. She named her first husband's violence in passages that the lawyers had asked her to soften, and that she had only softened slightly. She named her affair with John Holms. She named, with dates, her 12 nights with Samuel Beckett. She named, with cost, the paintings she had bought in Paris in 1940. She named, with venom and pity, her marriage to Max Ernst. She named her affair with Douglas Garman. She named, in cryptic letters and initials, an estimated 27 other lovers, almost all identifiable to anyone with a working knowledge of Bohemia. The Guggenheim cousins were furious for 3 layered reasons. The first reason was the obvious one. Peggy had broken the central rule of the American Jewish upper class, which was that family scandal was kept inside the family. She had broken it by putting the scandal in print. She had broken it specifically by naming her father's mistress, who was still alive in Paris in 1946. She had broken it by writing about her sister Hazel in terms that Hazel did not approve. She had broken it by mocking her cousins. The second reason was the sexual frankness. American nonfiction in 1946 did not ordinarily list the women a man had slept with. It absolutely did not list the men a woman had slept with. Even Anais Nin's diaries, which would not appear for another decade, would be released initially with the most explicit passages censored. Peggy named, dated, and scored her partners. The shock to the New York reading public was profound. The third reason was the most personal. Peggy had used the book to put the family's smallness into print. She wrote with the controlled rage of a daughter who had been told for 40 years that she was too plain, about the way her mother had ranked her sisters. She wrote about the dinner table comments. She wrote about the dance instructors. She wrote about the failed nose surgery. She wrote about the cousins who had not invited her to their weddings. The book was, among many other things, a 47-year overdue rebuttal of the verdict the family had passed on her at the age of 10. The critical reception was mixed. The New York Times called the book vulgar, but admitted that it was readable. The Saturday Review of Literature called it scandalous. Edmund Wilson, the most influential American critic of the period, wrote a private letter to a friend in which he said he had read it in 2 sittings and that it was a more honest piece of writing than 9/10 of what he had been asked to review that year. Beckett, sent a copy by Peggy, wrote a careful reply that thanked her for the gift, refused to comment on the passages about himself, and praised her descriptions of art buying in 1940. Pollock, sent a copy at her gallery's expense, wrote nothing. He was not a writer. The European reception was warmer. The book was translated into French and Italian and German across the late 1940s and 1950s. Peggy's existing European reputation as the patron who had saved modernism gave the book a cultural standing in Europe that it lacked in America. Surrealist friends in particular treated it as a primary document of the movement. The Guggenheim family's containment campaign included pressure on the Dial Press not to reprint. The Dial Press, after one further small printing, allowed the book to go out of print in 1948. It would not be reissued until 1979, the year of Peggy's death, when a revised and expanded edition was published under the new title, Confessions of an Art Addict. By then, almost everyone Peggy had named was either dead or beyond caring. The book, in its second life, became a feminist canonical text. It was reissued again in 1976. In an updated edition, Peggy supervised herself. The longer cultural effect was greater than the immediate scandal. Out of This Century was, although neither Peggy nor her publishers used the word at the time, the first major sexual autobiography by an American woman of independent means. It opened a door that the next 4 decades of feminist writing would walk through. Erica Jong, when she published Fear of Flying in 1973, sent Peggy a signed copy with a card that thanked her. Vivian Gornick, when she published Fierce Attachments in 1987, cited Out of This Century as her inspiration, 87, cited Out of This Century as one of the books that had made her own memoir possible. Eve Babbitt's, in her late 1970s Los Angeles essays, copied the tone almost verbatim. Joan Didion read it twice. Susan Sontag dismissed it in print and praised it in conversation. The Guggenheim family, in the long run, lost the public relations battle. The family's official histories now include Peggy, prominently and almost respectfully, as a figure in their cultural legacy. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation administers her museum. The descendants who once tried to buy up her book now own the rights to her name through the foundation. The cousin, Harry Guggenheim, who authorized the suppression in 1946, died in 1971. He did not live to see Peggy named, in serious art histories, as the most consequential patron of the American 20th century. The verdict on the book, like most verdicts in the family's long history, took more than 1 generation to settle. But Peggy lived long enough to enjoy the early phase of the reversal. She kept a copy of every printing of Out of This Century on the bookshelf in her library at the Palazzo. She kept the negative reviews in a folder marked, in her own handwriting, for laughs. She kept her cousin's letters of denunciation in a folder marked equally simply, Evidence. She had the last word, in private, every time a visitor asked. Chapter 12. What the Heiress Left Behind. When Peggy died in Venice in 1979, she was buried in the garden of the Palazzo beside the graves of her dogs, and the family came to the funeral late. The death came at 8 in the evening on December 23rd in a hospital in Padua, where she had been taken 3 days earlier after collapsing in the palazzo with what doctors initially diagnosed as a stroke. The cause of death listed on the certificate was congestive heart failure. She was 81 years old. She had been planning, before the collapse, to attend the opening of a new wing at the Peggy Guggenheim collection that the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation had begun to fund. The funeral was held at the Palazzo on December 27th. Approximately 140 people attended. The mourners included her son, Sindbad, who traveled from London with his wife. They included her grandsons Fabrice, David, and Nicholas Helion, the 3 sons of her daughter Pegeen by Pegeen's first marriage. They included Sandro Rumney, the youngest grandson, who Peggy had fought a decade-long custody battle for and lost, and who arrived from Paris alone at the age of 21. They included a small contingent of New York Guggenheim cousins who arrived on a delayed flight from Milan and reached the Palazzo as the service was ending. They included Italian art world dignitaries, including the director of the Biennale and the mayor of Venice. They included the gondoliers who had rowed her up and down the canal for 30 years and who insisted on attending in formal coats. Her ashes were buried in the garden in a small ceremony 2 days later. The plot was placed at the end of the row of dog graves, in the place she had reserved years earlier. The marker was a simple inscribed stone, Peggy Guggenheim, 1898 to 1979. The collection was transferred to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in accordance with the agreement signed in 1976. The Peggy Guggenheim collection opened to the public as a permanent museum in 1980. It has been open in the same palazzo on the same canal almost every day of every year since. By the early 21st century, it received approximately 400,000 visitors annually. It is one of the most visited museums in the city of Venice, which receives more visitors per square meter than any other city in the world. The total insured value of the works on the walls has been estimated in the late 2010s at between $500 million and $1 billion. The legacy in numbers is staggering. Peggy bought, across her lifetime, approximately 326 major works of art. She paid, in current dollars adjusted for inflation, between $3 and $5 million in total. The current value of those works, conservatively estimated, is between 500 and 1,000 times what she paid. The financial multiplier is, by itself, a small history of the rise of modern art as an asset class. But the more important legacy is the curatorial one. Peggy did not just buy assets that appreciated. She bought works by artists whose careers she made possible. Without Peggy, there is no Jackson Pollock as we now know him. Without Peggy, there is no Mark Rothko of the late 1940s. Without Peggy, the European modernists who fled in 1940 would have lost more of their work to the Nazi collectors and the destroyed studios. The list of what would not exist without her is far longer than the list of what does exist because of her. The personal legacy was different. The marriages had failed. The lovers had moved on or died. The daughter had died. The son lived another 7 years. The grandsons lived their own lives in Europe and Paris and Italy. The family she had been born into, the New York Guggenheims, had treated her, throughout her adult life, with a combination of scolding distance and gradual public reabsorption. The brothers had founded their own museums, mining schools, aviation labs, and educational foundations. The cousins had run the family fortunes into the 21st century. Peggy was, in the family history, the rebellious daughter who had nonetheless brought home a museum. She had not been a good wife. She had not been a good mother. She had not been a good daughter. She had, on her own terms, been a great patron and a great writer. The terms had cost her almost everyone she had loved. The terms had also produced the museum at the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, which more people now visit each year than visit any of the Marble Cousins museums in New York. And here, finally, is the philosophical point this story has been carrying since the Titanic. The Guggenheim brothers built their fortune by extracting metal from the earth. They dug, they smelted, they sold, they repeated. The work was the work of taking. The story of the family across 4 generations was, in its essence, a story of extraction at scale. Peggy did the opposite work. She used the smallest portion of that extracted wealth that landed in her hands, and she put it back into the world. She bought paintings the institutions did not want to save. She paid stipends to artists no one else would pay. She married a man whose passport was the only thing she could give him. She built a museum out of a Venetian ruin. She moved art across an ocean while empires fell. She did not extract anything. She preserved, she showed, she gave away. What do we owe a woman like that, who refused the family, married badly, lost a daughter, drank too much, slept with everyone she found interesting, and wrote it all down? We do not have to admire her. She would have laughed at us for trying, but we should at least notice, in the year we are watching this, how rare the work of preservation has become. The world mostly still extracts. The world mostly still digs. The few who preserve, who shelter, who put art behind glass on a canal and open the door 3 afternoons a week, are still rare. When she sat on the marble bench by the Grand Canal in the last summers, in the butterfly sunglasses with the dogs at her feet, she was performing the only public act she had left. She was watching. She was guarding. She was preserving. And she was waiting, with what looked like calm, for the small handful of strangers who would walk past and stop and look, and who would understand, even for a few seconds, what she had done. The most scandalous heiress of the 20th century, in the end, was not the woman of the 1,000 lovers. She was the woman of the 326 paintings. She had spent the lovers. She had kept the paintings. The math at the end was that simple, and the math at the end was the point. If this story moved you, subscribe so the next one finds you, and consider what you would have done with the checkbook at 21 in Paris, in a world packing for the trains south. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and which work in Peggy's collection would you most want to stand in front of on a quiet Venetian afternoon?